So this video is going to be about my sawmill building. I'm going to touch base on some pros and cons and why I built it the way I built it. This building is 56 feet long. Width-wise, wall to wall, it is 19 feet. This is the eave end. I have this whole wall boarded. There's windows in it, and there is a conveyor that is stored on the side of the building. The building is built partially on a slab that was pre-existing here. This slab was used for farm use, and it's actually on a grade. I think there's about 1.5 feet difference. The grade of the slab was not ideal. Shimmed all the way down to keep it level. So as you can see, I have the eave end wall fully boarded. Down on the far end, the wall is halfway boarded, and then these other walls are wide open. The reasoning for that is for the log deck that's further down. The outer rails of the log deck are about 12 feet across. I was trying to think of a maximum log that could fit through this wall here. That's why the poles are so far apart, because I wanted to be able to fit whatever I may end up putting through here. I partially boarded the end wall just to keep some of the wind out, and also that's where the slab ends, because the slab basically comes in this building halfway. The pre-existing slab is halfway in this building. We did have to pour a small slab underneath the engine. The slab we poured here was 6 by 8. We just reinforced it with some steel, and I think we ended up going about 6 inches thick. So far it hasn't cracked or anything weird. So my intentions was not to have this wall completely wide open as it is. The idea is in this location, this is where the boards and waste is coming out. I want it nice and wide open so that you're not working around a pole or any other obstructions. So the short-term plan was doing it like this with the sawdust. I did not want the sawdust going out in this area, but it's what was simplest, so we went with it. And between these poles that are close together, I was intending to have a wall here. A wall and build it around that sawdust tube that potentially is not permanent. So I've yet to do anything here, but something does need to happen sooner than later, because an issue that I have here is not only does my fan go in the wrong direction, it's pulling air towards the engine as typical, but I'd rather it go the other direction, because it's pulling sawdust onto the engine, into the air breather, and of course pulling sawdust towards the guys that are working here. So that's still a part of the plan, to put a small wall right there. But for the most part, this building is pretty great to work in. I think the I-beam is 56 feet long. That is 14 inches tall. I'm pretty sure the I-beam is 1/4 by 1/4. The upright poles, those are at least 5/16 wall. All the steel was salvaged. The I-beam was made up of about 5 sections. For example, right here, you can see it is spliced. And of course it is spliced multiple times because there is 5 sections. Each of those splices have a fish plate on the opposite side that you can't see. But it's been standing here for a year, and there has been a recent windstorm, and it's still here, so I'm not too worried about it. Of course, each pole is bolted down. We use 1/2-inch studs into the concrete. So this brace here is very important. Due to not having end walls, and of course this other wide open wall, the building was lacking a little bit of structure to keep it solid in place. You could grab a wall and you could wiggle it, but ever since that pole went in, it's made a world of difference. That is also 1/2-inch studs into the concrete. Someone could easily duplicate this building if they wanted to. The rafters of this building are 25 feet long. The stub wall above here is about 4 feet tall. The eve end wall is about 8 feet tall, near where the saw blade is, but of course because of the taper, the wall is tapered because the slab is on grade. We sawed out all the lumber for this building with this saw before the building was even here, obviously. The only thing we did not saw is the rafters. I was unsure the length of the lumber we would be able to make on this mill. I had actually bought this thing quite literally in a pile. And I was told it could cut 24-foot long material, but with the length of the track and whatnot, that made no sense. I know for sure it'll do 16 foot, probably up to 18 without much trouble. But the track itself is 48 feet long, and obviously you need to be able to come into the blade and out of the blade and whatnot. But anyways, that's why we just ended up buying the rafters, just to ensure we'd have plenty of length. I used engine oil on the lower portion of these walls, and I just oiled it in place just to help preserve the wood where it meets the concrete. We do have some metal flashing down in there. You can see that. That metal flashing is laid underneath the bottom plate, underneath the flashing to the concrete. We folded up a strip of water and ice, which is a tar-like material all the way down through. Now this is just because of this situation we did that, and the reasoning for it, which again, this slab is on grade. This whole area here is slab all the way to the barn, and when it melts it's going to go downhill, which is that way, and it runs along this wall. Also, we have the eve end of this building dumping snow on the slab, so I did not want water running underneath that wall into the mill area, freezing in there or whatever, rotting that bottom sill. So the idea is with this flashing, it'll help divert the water down the slab. I also snowplow this area, and I try to get fairly close to the building. We have been a little bit worried about frost heaves, but I've yet to see any issues. And we've run this mill summer, winter, and nothing ever seems to change, which is a good thing. But that is another thing to take into consideration when having a mill, and if you're leaving your concrete exposed or not, or what you even have for ground underneath it, depending on your area. So now I want to go over a few things that I would change about this building. I do know a lot of people come here and they think, wow, this is awesome, which it is, you know, don't get me wrong. It certainly is a good building, and we built it without having an awful lot of knowledge about how a circular saw works and things that are ideal to have. But this is what we come up with. So, for one thing, I would not build it on this slab that's on grade. The grade is no advantage in any way, which I'm not ever saying it was an advantage. It's just the slab was pre-existing here, so I didn't have to go and spend a bunch of money on making a slab or whatever. Not that you have to have one, but it sure is ideal. Also, the clearance underneath my saw husk, there's not much. I have a 48-inch blade, and from the bottom tooth to the concrete, there's about 4 to 5 inches. Now sure, that is clearance, you know, any clearance is plenty of clearance, right? Not that I plan to run a bigger blade, but I did leave that room there in case I did. That was my initial thought. But because of all the sawdust you end up accumulating, and there's no perfect way to get away from it, it sure would have been helpful to have a pit. It sure would be ideal to have a pit underneath the saw husk area, especially. And that would It would gain having storage for the sawdust to go as you're milling. Also, I would have liked to have the sawdust go out this wall, and that's typically how you see it on a circular saw, which it makes perfect sense. There's not much stuff going on this side of the mill, if not anything really. Also, the sawdust would be going away from the people that are working. It's also going away from your finished lumber, which would be in this area. You don't really want a bunch of sawdust blowing out on your boards, which I'm not saying it always does, but if the wind's right, it does. So that would definitely be a couple things I would change right there. Now, there's no perfect way of getting around the sawdust situation. It's going to get everywhere. Another thing I would change is fully boarding this wall. The reason it is the way that it is because this wall is built on a pre-existing curb, which is where the slab ends, and I poured a footer out there for the pole to sit on. But having that wall closed right there would help strengthen the building. I do plan to put some more diagonal framing on it just to stiffen the wall. I mean, as you can tell, there's diagonal framing all down this end wall, and the reasoning for that was back when we studded the wall, we threw those on because it was just scrap wood to keep the wall where we wanted it. But after we built the wall, there's no reason to take it down, and it doesn't interfere or anything. So although they're not even or anything, it doesn't matter. It's doing some good. The other thing I would change would be the distance between these two poles. I was trying to think about maximums when building this, because that's sort of what you have to think about is the largest log you're going to bring in here. And I honestly wasn't too sure. I don't know the distance of those two poles right offhand, but this pole here, for example, your sawyer stands here. That pole is all the way over there. You're not going to roll the log necessarily through where the sawyer stands. The end of the log is going to be more so right in line with the end of that log deck. Having the poles closer together would just support the I-beam better. My original thought with the sawdust was having a blower that would send it out that end wall. Here's just a quick overview of what I have going on with the sawdust blower. So basically, pull up this board here. Not really where I want to dump that. I have a box that's built down below here. And let me look inside. This is where I access it to clean out. There was a ton of sawdust in there because right now it's pretty well plugged up. And the steel pipe that goes to the blower is right there. That pipe is only about 6 feet long. This area here around the blade is kind of shrouded in. Now, I'm not saying this is a good setup at all. I'm just saying this is what I had. This was quick and this was easy. I would have much rather have the pipe at the bottom of the blade in the rear so that the sawdust is going into the pipe no matter what. Kind of the way it is right now is the sawdust is going down and it's getting pulled directly sideways. So it does work, it just doesn't work great. Which no matter what, sawdust is going to get anywhere. So this right here was a quick thing I had threw together. It works actually pretty well. So normally you would have a screen inside your blower pipe, like a piece of fencing or something. I tried that and it really didn't take long at all for that thing to plug up. So I don't know, it ends up going to the blower and a lot of it will pass through the blower, but this just makes it real quick and easy to get right in here, take whatever is in it and clean it out. I mean, I gotta do something more here. It's kind of falling apart, but it does work. I ended up making this blower tube, use boards on the sides, just used some sheet metal, just drove some nails through it. That actually worked pretty well. This was a cheap blower I had picked up. Right now I have it near a 1-to-1 ratio with the engine. And this is constantly turning when the engine fires up. This is not clutched. It's just on a tensioner is all that is. And this works really good. It does have an electric motor. I had the electric motor hooked up, but the thing is, I like mechanical stuff. This was just a really simple setup, but unfortunately, due to having it drive off the engine, it dictates it has to sit in that spot. So, I don't know. This blower does work pretty good. The way that it is, it's pretty reasonable. And pushing the sawdust up about 6 feet and out another 6 feet, I normally park a horse trailer here, and it will shoot the sawdust all the way to the front of that horse trailer. And I would think that horse trailer is about 10 feet long. So, you know, at best, it's throwing it all the way to the front, and that's good enough for me. It's just unfortunate that I can't put the sawdust somewhere a little further away. It has been thought about to try to run something underneath the log deck and go out the end wall, which would be great, but the further you go with sawdust in a blower, you tend to have a lot of trouble unless you got some big blower. But the bigger blower you got, the more power you're losing. So it's just what I have, and it works. So, you know, maybe you can take something from what I got going on and make your setup a little better. So since I'm talking about the blower, I am sure people are sort of wondering what that is, and other people already got it figured out. But basically, it's kind of like a homemade shop vac, I guess. Now, all that is one of those dust collectors you would find in like a wood shop. And I got a PVC pipe on it. It runs parallel to the sawdust tube. And obviously I'm using it to suck up sawdust. So that's blowing it into the horse trailer as well. So when we're doing cleanup stuff, it sure is a lot easier to clean out underneath this husk with the sucker. So all it is 4-inch. It's got this flexible pipe. All this is exhaust tubing. And it works okay, but you know, it is a blower, not a sucker, so it really doesn't do its job too well. I mean, you can plug this thing up pretty easily. I have thought about taking the blower and putting it down lower so that it's not having to lift the sawdust so high before it's able to push it out. Because maybe having it down low, it pushes way better than it sucks. Maybe it would work better, I'm not really sure. It's the first way I put it up, and it's been working good enough. So I've been working with it. These windows were a later on addition to the building. Those were removed from a camper. That just helps bring some light into this area, and then also some ventilation, which in between the rafters are open as well. Here's another view of those windows from the outside. Right now they're all covered in sawdust and everything else. The other negative about this, having this slab on grade, it makes it to where the guy over here has a hard time reaching the carriage. Now, it's really not jacked up very much here. We're looking at a 4-inch block with a 2x on top. And right here, we're looking at a 2-inch block with that, like another 3 inches on top. And then right here, we're looking at about 8 inches with a shim. So it does gain pretty good. When you work in the sawmill, sometimes the guy over here has to be able to reach the carriage and the dogs and whatnot to take a board out. And typically that's at the very last one. So the carriage mechanisms are as close as possible to you. So it's the most ideal situation in order to reach those, but it does get a little difficult. Having these rollers a little narrower would help. As you can see, I got 2 different widths going on. That's just because it's what I could get. The other thing too is you can see how far these rollers are spaced out. It's because I don't have all the rollers, so I made it to where it would work, but it definitely is not ideal, because sometimes as the board's coming off, it tends to try to drop down in those and then kind of jam up. And I'm kind of worried somebody's going to put their hand in there and get it in between the board. So far, so good, but that needs to happen sooner than later. I really don't want someone to get hurt. Alright, so back to the building itself. I keep getting distracted. Anyways, you could easily duplicate this setup. you know, you can take a little bit here and there on the way I made it and make it your own way, but it sure does work good. The whole idea of not really having anything going on with the eve end wall is because it's the eve end. I don't know how many saw buildings I see and the eve end goes right towards where you're going to load a pickup truck or the logs are coming in. So you're putting all that water and everything else on your logs that may become ice or what have you. It just doesn't really help. So that was kind of the thought with that. We were using what we had, which, you know, the slab was one of those things. The log deck is some truck frame and whatnot. These I-beam were from a friend that likes to salvage steel, which it's a good friend to have. So really not in this building with very much money at all. I do know the rafters were a little bit over $1,500, and that of course had a little bit of COVID price on it, but the rest of it was milled. So logs were all cut around here, and the effort it took to mill them, which sure, it was some effort, but it really wasn't that bad at all. And we used a lot of kind of oddball stuff on this building. There's wormholes in these boards. That's just because those logs were a little bit old, so I didn't really care. You know, my aspect, that's ventilation. I feel like a lot of people don't think through a building, and realistically, you gotta take in everything into consideration. Here is the log deck area. There's plenty of room out here to stack logs, move around machinery, whatever it takes to get it on the log deck. The poles of the building are far enough apart to where pretty well, no matter how the log comes on there, it'll go through. You can get it to the carriage. There's plenty of length here. This log deck's like 20 feet long. Get that log straightened out if need be, if you don't already do it with the machinery. Having the roof go the direction away from where you're working so that you're not working in the eaves. Having the sawdust go in a place to where it makes sense, which this one does not make sense, but it works. Having plenty of an area to work to where there's no poles or walls that you're working around, any obstructions that you have to trip over. This wall's nice and wide open to where actually you have two different directions you can go here. Typically we'll have a waste trailer here. Over there's a lumber pile currently, but depending if you're doing multiple different species of wood or dimensions, you can divvy it up a little bit. And then also, you know, when you got the finished product here, where are you going? You got two different ways you can go here. Then also, depending on what you're sawing or intending to saw, you may want to put something through an edger or a planer or a shaper. I'm not sure. I understand there's a lot of different variables. You need to let the boards dry and such, depending on what process you're doing. Typically you have an edger with a circular saw. If you think you're not going to make slabs, think again. You're going to make slabs. And sure, you can cut your slabs on the circular saw, but it takes effort and whatnot. And I am not saying that these things are super ideal, but they do work and have their place. There will be a follow-up video soon about the edger specifically. Now this is the far end of the edger. This is where your material will come out. You can throw it here in a pile, stack it, whatever you need to do. It's all about having plenty of room to do what you need to do so you can get the job done in a timely order without too much struggle. So looking at the underside of the tin, you can tell I got different sheets of tin going on here. Galvanized tin was actually everything off of a house that was in a nearby town. They had taken it off. They wanted to use painted tin, something like that. It's one of those marketplace finds. I think I had paid $400 for all of the tin from a house, and it covered a lot of this building. And we had some tin that was kicking around that was painted, which is what you see is painted here. The painted's a whole row up there, but that helped with cost. It really doesn't have to be perfect. I'm not sure if it shows up on camera, but there is screw holes in the old tin. And I guess the one thing you should look for is this having screw holes in the rib or on layout to where you can put a new screw in the old hole with your strapping. All our strapping is on 2-foot center. Our rafters are on 2-foot center, but because the holes were in the rib, they're less apt to get water through them. This roof is not perfectly watertight, but it is plenty good for what we're doing.